that we're going to show you is perhaps a familiar diagram from the very beginning of the project, and it exemplifies one of our key concepts, which is in Boston, that North Square is not a place for one story, it's a place for an infinite number of stories. And we have chosen sort of 4 threads to focus on, 4 story threads. And this is our diagram for those threads, and there are 4 sculptures, 1 for each of those threads. So we're going to show you, this is an early rendering we did for the project. And this is actually what it's starting to look like. It really is. This little green is missing, and then we're there. And you'll notice at various points, oh, thank you, Dave. At various points around the circle, you'll see benches, but also bases with sculptures on it, and that's what we're going to talk to you about. The first sculpture is called a 1798 North Square view, which Jeremy will tell you about.
All right, this is a relief sculpture, and it shows the view from more or less that spot in the year 1798. So it's before any skyscrapers and also before the hills were cut down. There were 3 pretty large hills in downtown Boston up until about 1800 when they started tearing them down and filling.
Using them from landfill.
So this sculpture is the view of the city at that time. There's still some buildings in existence in the city today that are shown in the relief. There's a key along the bottom of the sculpture, which you can see at the bottom here, which is numbered. It's an index. And then there are numbers up in the relief that pick out various buildings and features that you can see today in the city. And on each end of the sculpture we have a drawing. This is of the USS Constitution, which was built in the north end and then launched in 1797. And then on the other end is the old State House, which was occupied up until 1798 when the new State House became the seat of the state government.
And 1798 was a crucial year in Boston's history, and that's why we're choosing to focus on it. And we're presenting it now almost in comparison to the view of the city today, because today is also a crucial moment in Boston's history that we're living in. So we're making that strong comparison between these 2 moments in history. And then on the opposite side of the relief, you see
North Square marker, label for North Square.
it's the only.
And this, you'll see this as you approach from the south, coming up past Paul Revere House, following the Freedom Trail, for instance. You'll see this sign for North Square on the backside of the sculpture. And then the second sculpture is the North End story map. It's a map of the North End. This is an overhead view of the model before we took it to the foundry. It was milled through a computer milling process, and it's accurate for the year 2018-2019. And there's an index on this map as well. In the lower right here, you can see we have a star marker for your location in North Square. The Freedom Trail is marked, and we have churches and schools. And then there's a scale, and we also reference a website where we're going to be implementing a story vault, an archive of North End stories. And that's going to be something that will be developed over the next year or so.
There's also Braille on that index. I don't know if you can make it out there, sort of those aluminum reflective surfaces. Those are Braille text. The foundry process is, maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's a detailed process that we won't go into now, but essentially you go from a model, let's say something like clay or foam, into wax and then into bronze, which is what these pieces will wind up as. So this is the wax model. And you can see it's a highly detailed model that's meant to be explored closely.
What period is that of the street design that you have?
That's 2019, and we were actually adding buildings while we were making the map because of the changes going on in the north end.
And we've hidden some little secret sort of things in the map. There's a penny there, you can just see it on the roof of the Bruce building. We have some cannoli, some garlic, a loaf of bread, some other things that people can find in the streets.
The important stuff. It's meant to be a sort of a treasure hunt in the end. Those areas in the final bronze cast will be highlighted as a sort of lighter patina. Some of them will, the evening as well. So our third sculpture, as we go around the planter clockwise, is called a fantastical historical nautical instrument. And when we responded to the request for proposals for this project initially, one of the most important requests that came up from the community was that we focus on the North Square's strong connection to the harbor and to the water. Whether it involved feeding people, because that's where we fish, boats coming from places all over the world. Those sorts of connections were really important, the nautical or marine connections. So we came up with this design for a sculpture that really looks at sextants and other nautical navigation instruments. And you can see that the sculpture is resting on 3 figureheads, which are sitting on a surface that's basically a wave surface. It's a water surface. There are these upright supports and other elements, all of which have drawings on them that tell stories, lots of different stories. And they refer to sailors' scrimshaw, sort of this method of carving whalebone that sailors would often do to pass the time. So they're like sort of pieces that are covered with these drawings. And then there are these 5 scopes that are being supported by those uprights. And the 5 scopes each have an image of them when you look down the scope. But you can only see that image when you look through the eyepiece, because although you see there's a kind of wave surface with a pattern on it, it's not sort of dark enough in this room, but that pattern is actually the drawing, which lights itself when you look through the scope. It's called an anamorphic image.
This is looking through the scope, and this is looking at right from the side.
And there are 5 images, one for each scope. Sarah Joseph Hale, who was connected to the Mariner's House. Onesimus, who was connected to the Second Church. The Andrea Doria, which was a famous ship that was wrecked in 1956. Honey Fitzgerald and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, excuse me. And then also Reverend Edward Taylor of Siemens Bethel, which is now Sacred Heart Church.
Sculpture.
Yeah, the 4th sculpture, the final one we'll discuss, is it's called What We Brought With Us, and this is the sculpture that's sort of right outside Sacred Heart Church, and it's basically a suitcase with a world popping out of it. And you can see on the outside of an historical suitcase that we used to use luggage labels to talk about the places where we come from. And so this suitcase will also have luggage labels on the outside. Here's the inside. It's basically an image of North Square or Sacred Heart Church, and a feast going through North Square. And it's hard to see, but upper left-hand corner you can see there are lots of little people going through the square, which you'll be able to see when you get close to it. And there's a saint being carried on their shoulders. On one side of one of those apartments is this living room scene. It's a cold water flat, and it's basically a grandma who is looking out at the feast and also looking at a scene that we can't see from this view, which we'll talk about in a second. And she comes from a book by Anthony Riccio called From Italy to the North End, which was really influential in our work on this piece. Some of you might be familiar with this book, but the images in that book of especially the North End in the 1970s really were where we got this room from and the scene inside. There's a quote on the wall. It's in Neapolitan dialect. I'm not going to attempt it, but in English, the quote is, in every city you will find a friend, in every country you will find your little house. This was something that was a proverb that Antonia, I think Trevillo was her last name, she actually told this to the author, and it's recorded at the end of the book, so that's on the wall in the living room. And there are portraits of Italians, that some familiar and some unfamiliar from the North End on the wall.
And through the window.
there's a scene, yes. And it's actually a ship arriving in the harbor, and it's the USS Constitution, which was a ship that a lot of immigrants used to come to Boston from Naples. So you can only see it by looking over her shoulder through the window. On the outside, as I said, there will be luggage labels, and for those we relied on working with 3 groups of kids to draw the labels, which we're translating into 3-dimensional designs using a CNC milling machine. So we wound up with 70 labels, primarily done by kids from St. John's School and the Elliott School. And here are the workshops, which were recorded by Christina Carroll with the Mayor's office. So that's basically the workshop resulted in the drawings that you'll see in this next image on the left. And then on the right are the luggage labels themselves, which we're casting in wax and then applying to the wax cast that gets sent through bronze and cast in bronze. So luggage labels from basically all over the world, but 25% of them, I think at least, are Italian luggage labels. And the patina. The patina is what you basically, before a bronze sculpture leaves the foundry, it gets a patina applied to it, which is relatively stable. And so that patina has a certain coloration, a color palette, and that's what we're looking at here. This is the color palette that the bronze sculptures will be done in. And that's it in a nutshell. If there's time, we would welcome any questions or comments. And then also we have business cards for the story wall if you want to take one and you're interested in the project overall. Please feel free.
When is the opening?
Working on a date. Probably sometime late September, early October. In yeah, the overall project we're nearing substantial completion probably next month sometime.
So is there, yeah, I really like it, but is there a sticker from Ireland?
Oh, yeah.
It's more than
What materials are these made of? And what I'm thinking basically is, are they safe? With people banging into them at 3 o'clock in the morning and stuff like that.
You mean with
vandals stealing them? You know.
That is an excellent question, which we've talked about throughout the project, and it's critically important that we design the sculptures so that they are as powerful and as strong as they can be, so that you can't just walk over them and tear them apart. There is no way to prevent terrible things from happening in public spaces to sculptures, and USS St. Gaudens 54th Regiment Memorial is a good example. And it's right across from the State House, and almost every year the sword of Shaw's sword gets stolen. So in a very common place, that's constantly happening, but we have done our very best to make sure that these are as strong as possible.
You keep a master model or something of it so that it's really disastrous. You make it again with one location.
Definitely. Definitely.
Thank you very much.
All right.